All right, I don't see anyone else in the waiting room, so we'll get started. Good morning. Welcome to our webinar on non-clinical or indirect procurement. We appreciate each of you taking time out of what is likely a busy day, busy week, busy month, busy year to join us, and hopefully we'll share some information that is of interest and informative to you and worth the time that you're spending here. I'll apologize in advance for that yapping dog in the background, one of the vestiges of the post-pandemic period and the work-at-home lifestyle for that many of us have here. Over the next hour, we aim to offer some insight on what we believe is still a relatively untapped area of cost and service improvement for healthcare systems, that is spending on non-clinical or indirect goods and services. We'll offer a definition and a scope of what we mean by non-clinical spending. Outside of healthcare, companies refer to this as, quote, goods not for resale, unquote. And that definition encompasses anything and everything that these companies procure that do not make it into the product that's sold to their customers. In healthcare, this could mean anything that is not used directly in patient care. Regardless of industry, in all cases, it is essentially all the goods and services necessary to operate the business, but are not sold to patients or delivered to patients during the patient care process. Our agenda today is fairly straightforward. In a few moments, I'll formally introduce my friend and colleague and co-host here, John Dawkins from the Cleveland Clinic. And then we're going to launch into a discussion of the current state of non-clinical or indirect procurement in healthcare, particularly in contrast to what we observe in the retail, consumer packaged goods, and financial services industries. One item of particular note, the experiences and frankly that the head start that companies outside of healthcare have in these areas is particularly important for us to understand. As we explore the categories and the scope of non-clinical or indirect spending, you may conclude that we, quote, compete with companies outside of healthcare for the same goods and services that these companies are already procuring themselves, are procuring on the benefit of their own organizations. To the degree that many or most of these companies have a head start by focusing on these indirect categories, or they do it better, since we are competing with the same vendors and the same goods and services, we place a significant financial burden on our health systems. Said another way, it represents a great opportunity for us to provide some very necessary relief on the cost of healthcare and our expense base as we face the post-pandemic period. We're going to introduce a simple, albeit imperfect, maturity model for you to use as a self-diagnostic tool for assessing where you are today with respect to indirect procurement. It's by no means perfect. Instead, it's intended to just take a snapshot of where you are today and to help you think of a roadmap for how you get to a more robust indirect procurement capability. As we go through this, we do want your questions. James Bouchard, the LogicSource Associate Partner and Head of LogicSource's Center of Excellence, will be monitoring the Q&A section of this webinar, and he will either answer the questions directly to the person that posed it. If it's of a general nature, he'll answer it for the benefit of all, and you'll see that in the Q&A. Or in some cases, we may tee them up at the end for John or myself to answer for the benefit of the group. Now, we have disabled the chat function, so pay attention to the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. And let's try it out here for a second. I'd ask each of you just to select that and send a, quote, question, although it's not really a question, just let James know where you are today, where you're watching this webinar, what city in the country, what country are you calling in from. I'll give you a minute to get comfortable with that. All right, on to the important stuff. First of all, it's my pleasure, and I'm just frankly delighted that John Dawkins is joining me today. Um, John is someone I've known for a long time. We've had the opportunity on several occasions to explore different things together. I find him just incredibly insightful, knowledgeable in this area, and really all dimensions of supply chain. And of course, representing the Cleveland Clinic, comes from an area of an organization that is truly invested in its supply chain and its procurement function, and frankly, in the indirect area. So John is very well versed in this area. He's currently serving as the executive director of sourcing and vendor management at the clinic. Indirect procurement is one of his responsibilities, and he's been at this a long time. John, welcome. Delighted to have you. Any words of wisdom or thoughts before we get started from you?
Well, I'll just say thanks, Mark, for such a gracious introduction there. I appreciate it. No, I'm happy to talk about this topic, and I think hopefully as we go through this, and I'm excited to see the number of people that have joined. I think it's a topic that doesn't probably get talked about as much as it should around the healthcare industry, and I'm hoping that what I share, which is, hey, it's what's worked for us, it's what's worked for the Cleveland Clinic, and if there are some things and some nuggets that people can take away from that, happy to share.
Great. Well, thank you, John. And hopefully we'll spend most of our time in this hour learning and hearing from John what they've been doing. They've been on a 17-year journey in indirect procurement, and they do it in a big way. And you'll see some of that as we go forward. Now, as far as myself, just very quickly, I'm the general manager within LogicSource, responsible for the healthcare vertical. In addition, I'm blessed to be able to serve on the board of directors of Crown Healthcare Laundry, which processes in excess of 200 million pounds of laundry for healthcare systems and clinics out of Florida, mostly in the Southeast, and as non-executive chair of Tri-Imaging Solutions, which is a diagnostic imaging parts service and training organization. I spent 20 years with Ernst & Young, Canada's a partner, starting and leading the healthcare supply chain practice, and then 11 years at Owens & Minor as the chief strategy officer. So I've been all over this industry and been blessed to work with many of you within the supply chain during this career. All right, so let's move on to the current state of non-clinical or indirect procurement in healthcare. John, as we get started, let me ask you to dive in a little bit into the clinic itself, your procurement function. It's a rather robust activity, and specifically the 17-year journey that the clinic and you have taken in the indirect spending area.
Yeah, so I'll start with how do we define, sourcing and vendor management, which is my area of responsibility that I'm fortunate to lead, and that is really all things sourcing. And so by that, there's physician preference items, implants, right? There's commodities. So PPI and commodity make up our clinical side of the house. We also then have our pharmaceutical sourcing, which does reside under myself. The buying of the pharmaceuticals, just for a point of clarity, happens in our pharmacy operations team and not in supply chain. But pharmacy sourcing does sit in our supply chain under me, as well as what we're talking about today, which is indirect. And so, yeah, we've been at this for a long time. We've got about 50 people total in my team, and that comprises of sourcing, contracting, value analysis, and vendor management. So I can appreciate that number probably might sound like a big number to some, but I just want to make sure that that's the point of clarity is right, is that's a group of people doing all those things around what we would consider the RFX, contract negotiations, value analysis after the fact for compliance and formulary, and then obviously our vendor management function. We have about 90, I'm going to round up because 91% sounds better to me than 90.9%. We've got about 91% of spend under contract right now, and we are consistently every day chewing away at that last 9+%, trying to get to that holy grail of 100. it's a journey. I don't know if we'll ever get there, but we're going to keep at it until we keep chewing away at it. So.
Yeah, John, that's tremendous. And when you speak of the 90% coverage, as we go through this, I think one of the our hopes is that we'll share with the audience today just how broad of a scope that you have across these indirect categories. And we'll spend some time momentarily just how broad that is. So I would suspect that most people on the call, for the areas that they have authority, responsibility, and control of, they would also be able to quote some high coverage rates. But what we find in many cases that the procurement function hasn't yet been given full authority and strategic participation across all of these categories. And we'll spend some time illuminating what those categories are. John, just a quick question, and we'll go deeper in some of these areas. You've been at this for a while, but you haven't perfected it yet necessarily. I think you're not resting on your laurels. What are the biggest challenges that you're facing today in addressing non-clinical or indirect spend?
Yeah, I think I would probably answer that more broad for a second. Right, so I think there's a couple of different areas that are primary focus that to say we focus on it every day and have conversations about it would be an understatement. But it's really around third-party risk, and I'll define that a little bit more in a second. But then in addition to that, it's around having good data and price inflation, which I have to assume that everyone on the call understands the current state of those calls that we get saying, one of our suppliers is asking for an increase, or whether it's during a renewal or just off contract cycle. So we're battling inflation every day to keep our prices and our total expense structure low. And then having good data and the foundations in place, which we have been making great strides around so that we can take advantage of, frankly, some of the more fun stuff and cool stuff that we all, can't get away from these days. And I'll use the broad term AI, right? Whether that's large language models or RPA, any of that stuff. Going back to third-party risk, I will summarize that, and this is a broad brush, but for the sake of time today and answering that question, I would define it as supply chain resiliency, which is, probably a heavily used phrase these days post-pandemic, right? Do we have the right supplies in the right place at the right time? Do we have proper backups and subs and clinically vetted alternatives, all those fun things? But I think it also has to be expanded into broader supply disruptions. And most people will generally think about cybersecurity risk, but I would broaden that to any supply disruption. And I saw a number of folks answer that first question that you're calling in from the Northeast. And so no doubt we've all seen the latest news of the bridge collapse and the cargo ship that hit the bridge and it collapsed, and now the impact that we're probably all scrambling, trying to figure out what impact is that port closure and the lack of potential goods coming out of that port going to have on our hospital operations. So I think those are, that's how I would answer. I think those are the broad brush strokes of biggest challenge that we're facing today.
All right, thank you, John. Now let's drill a little more specifically. We've been talking about, in general terms, non-clinical or indirect spending. What I'm going to share here on this page and the next is LogicSource's taxonomy for indirect or non-clinical spending. John, yours varies from this, although I would argue that when we get down to its lowest level, we've probably got pretty solid alignment in terms of what constitutes indirect spend. But within our taxonomy, we think of at level 1, the highest level at the top of this chart, there are 6 broad categories. Corporate services, which is exceedingly broad and probably not very descriptive as a naming convention, but corporate services, and I'll expand on that a little bit. Information technology, facilities, marketing, furniture, fixtures, and equipment, and distribution logistics. So when we think about indirect spending, we think about all of the spending that falls into those categories. Now, at level 2, so for example, for corporate services, at level 2, we think of several categories of items that fit within that. Benefits, finance, food services, human resources, real estate, travel. So that would be level 2. At level 3, at the finest level of detail that we get to it, I've exploded the finance one to 10 categories of spending that fall within this category, if you will, from accounts payable to audit recover or credit recovery, banking, credit card processing, risk management, equipment financing, and the like. So you can see as you peel away this onion, you get very, very finite in terms of the categorization of spending in these areas. Now, there are several hundred, if not thousand, different categories that fall into this taxonomy when you get to level 3. So it's a really, really broad in scope. And when I look at it from the experiences that I've had with my clients, my customers across the healthcare system over the last 40, 45 years, the procurement function certainly plays an important role across some or several of these categories. But the state of the art has not pushed it as far as it can or needs to across all of these. For example, does the procurement function get to tell the HR Chief Human Resource Officer no with respect to a contract or a procurement activity that's going forward? Do they get to do the same thing on real estate? What about human resources or other things? So it gets to be fairly broad and very intense in terms of the effort required to effectively manage the procurement strategy in this. Giving you another example in facilities, which is broken into at the second level, 10 categories, and then at the third level under safety and security, there are a number of 15 subcategories underneath that fall within that. And so this is how we look at the broad scope of indirect services and start to identify where is the impact, where is the contract coverage, where is the control across the spending in each and every one of these categories. So, John, again, I preface that your categorization probably differs from this, but there's probably a pretty significant overlap. If you want to comment and share your insight on this as well, and where you're really making your biggest impact.
Yeah, I agree, Mark. Well, I would actually say probably one of the biggest challenges is the lack of a standard categorization model. There's a number of them out there, and people can point to unspec or something else, but like when you really get down to it, I think many fall short of what it is. So in the end, I don't know that it matters. I think when you get to this deep level of like what you have on the screen here, makes sense. When I'm asked a question like, can you define indirect or non-clinical? I always find it easier, frankly, to start with what it isn't, right? It's not an implant. It's not a commodity. It's not something that's used directly on patient care, like a pharmaceutical or something else. Therefore, if you rule those out, it's basically everything that remains, right? Which is everything you've got on the screen. The other way, if I'm joking around about it, I usually say it's the stuff that no one cares about until you don't have it. So, and I'm usually referring to things like, toilet paper. No one really cares where you get the toilet paper or how much you have on the shelf. But boy, the second you run out into a particular restroom, procurement's sure to get the phone call of why don't we have it. So, anyways, it's I think you've got a great classification here system here. How people code it or record it at level 1, 2, 3. I don't know that matters. It's being able the action steps come from when you get deep enough to really classify.
Yeah, John, that point well taken. And I think another important aspect of this is just to gain the appreciation for how broad in scope and how much spend goes on in these categories. And frankly, what we have found, and John's been blessed, I think, by strong support within the clinic organization, that the procurement function, and particularly the indirect activity under John's responsibility, has a seat at the table across many of these categories. Maybe not all of them, but certainly a significant share of them. and are involved early on. John, it's not just simply negotiating the final contract. You get engaged early on in a number of these cases. And you might want to speak to
Yeah, no,
engagement.
I can comment on that. You're right. I think I'd probably change it now in our journey that we're beyond trying to get a seat at the table. And we're actually, a valued partner that is thought of to try to help. Don't get me wrong, out of the 91% of spend under contract, there's probably a full 1% of that to where, we still have our pockets that we're chasing where someone submitted a contract saying, here, can't you just sign this and get this done for me, right? And so there's still, I don't want to paint a picture that is less than accurate. There's still some areas that people like to hold on to that we're constantly working at. But by and large, we're past that stage of just trying to convince people that we can add value and please let us in. We do sit at the table of all these leaders, and we're extended member of their teams for strategy sessions, and it goes well beyond cost cutting. I think for us, and this is a tribute to all those at the Cleveland Clinic that came before me because it predates me. But around 18 years ago, almost 18 years ago, 17 and change, the decision was, well, hey, let's look at our total spend and where do we need to go after. And it was, up until, probably even more recent years, it was still the same answer. Is you could go and someone say, well, how much money do you spend on IT? And, I'd go to the board and draw a circle and write a number in it. And they're like, great. How much of that is on server and networking? And I would point to the circle and say, that's what I can tell you because I don't know what all's in that circle. I can tell you how much we spend in IT, but I can't tell you what's beneath the surface. So I think we started from a place of we could clearly get data on our pharmaceuticals. We could clearly get data on the clinical goods side of the house, commodities and physician preference items. And then you just take that minus the total spend and you're like, okay, well, that's the bucket. I think for me, when I talk to my peers out in the industry, I think indirect spend makes up anywhere from a third to probably half of the total spend. And so for us, we were fortunate, and the people before me, almost 18 years ago, made the decision of why wouldn't we attack that? It's a big spend area. Why would we want to ignore it?
Yeah, but John, what strikes me on a lot of these categories and making progress as an industry or as a discipline, if you will, is a challenge because you can take any one of these. The CIO will have very strong opinions, loyalties, ideas as to what needs to, who the organization needs to work with and what the parameters around there. The chief marketing officer with their preferred agencies and their strategy of marketing the organization. We can go across any one of these. And one can envision some pretty significant roadblocks or barriers being placed in front of, don't mess around in my area. We've got something that works, it works well. Facilities, particularly if you're making significant investments in new brick and mortar. You're relying upon construction managers and outside groups that there's long relationships. So how is it that you're able to get and retain that seat at the table within your organization? Because that's a big challenge, I think, for most organizations.
Yeah, I appreciate that follow-on question because I'll share. Maybe I would phrase it this way. There's a number of different levers that we have pulled and will continue to pull because it's not a one size fits all, right? It does come from a place, I think, of some may believe that they're going to lose control or there's a fear of, letting someone else in their shop. And I'm sure we've all heard those type of justifications as to why supply chain is not needed in their area. I think first and foremost, we took a stance, from early on that the person who gets to report out the wins, whether that's a savings to their budget, whether it's, hey, we just got better terms, whether it was, oh my gosh, something really catastrophic happened and it was an agreement that supply chain negotiated with great term for convenience clauses. Supply chain was not the one up in front of the organization telling the story. it was the business leader that represented that area who received that recognition and that credit. So we took that as a very strategic approach from the beginning of the business needs to get the credit and be the one seen as doing the right things. And what we found is in almost every case, while they were telling that story, they highlight the work and the partnership that the supply chain team and the procurement team brought to them. But I do think overall it comes from that as well as you have to deliver. So my advice would be pick an area that you do have some level of expertise in. It could be facilities, it could be HVAC specifically, it could be waste management, it could be IT, and find a partner internally that is open, and then use them as your use case and your where you're launching pad to do more.
Right, right. Yeah, John, certainly having contracting and procurement skills are necessary but insufficient. In the areas that I think you've been successful is you've come to the table with deep category expertise, so that you're on par with the business owner in terms of knowledge and insight in terms of the vendors that play in that market. What makes the difference between good service and bad service? So that you weren't just processing or negotiating contracts, you were really helping to understand value. That,
Yeah.
that only comes through deep competency.
Yeah, you're right. And we didn't build this overnight, right? We're still on that journey, frankly.
Yeah.
But we started, and again, it's just happened to be where we had expertise, 17, 18 years ago. We had it in that, actually, ironically, basically some of these areas you've got on screen still. So we had, 3 or 4 people that were on staff then for indirect, and they came from an automotive background. They came from all non-healthcare backgrounds. So they had expertise in facilities maintenance and janitorial and waste management. And at the core of it, with the exception of some nuances around maybe sharps containers and, biohazards and things like that. But I mean, generally it's the same, whether it's healthcare or not. And so that's where we started. And we just kept building from there.
Yep. Very good. Thank you, John. Let's, and by the way, don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A section there that either James can answer as we're going along, or John and I will pick up toward the end. Let's sort of put this into perspective, if you will. So hopefully we've conveyed the broad scope of indirect or non-clinical spend, and it's very significant, very broad. It's not simply purchase services. That's a part of it, but it's much broader than that. We've had the opportunity to analyze data, by data, AP spend, contracts, rate cards, et cetera, from several dozen healthcare organizations and from literally hundreds of non-healthcare companies. Several things stand out to us in and outside of healthcare as we look at this. One is rather consistently, about 20% of revenue is consumed by indirect spending. John, I think that parallels your idea that 50% of the spending that you look at is indirect, 50% is direct. That's about correct. It's congruent with that idea that 20% of revenue is consumed across companies on their indirect activities. That's a big number, particularly when we're facing the financial pressures in this industry that we are. Now, in fact, the percentage is slightly higher in healthcare in the population we've looked at than outside of healthcare, but it's still rather consistent. Secondly, and this was the eye-opener for me, having spent my entire career in healthcare and most of it in supply chain, when we look at this spending across all of these healthcare systems that we've looked at, about from a low of 12 to a high of 25% of that spending is covered by group purchasing contracts. Much lower than I would have anticipated, but as you step back and look at the broad expensive categories, it makes a lot of sense. A lot of these categories do not lend themselves to national contracts or unit price. They're much more nuanced than this. They either have to be delivered locally or they have to take into account dimensions of service quality or dimensions of the strategy that just don't lend themselves to those types of things. John, perhaps you can comment a little bit on that from your experience, if you
Yeah,
would.
and I'm gonna broad brush for a second because I don't I hope my comments don't come across as negative necessarily to any of the GPOs, but I think the GPOs are in the same situation, frankly, as the health systems are. GPOs for the most part all got their start in commodities.
Right.
And then they moved upstream into physician preference items because again of the clinical alignment and the nature of, cost of goods sold and those type of things. I think most of the GPOs are generally trying to figure that out. So they're no different than the health systems. They have to go find that expertise. They have to build up that expertise. And frankly, when you start overlaying cybersecurity provisions and nuanced things that each health system is going to have in their own policies, it's really difficult for a GPO to write an agreement, specifically in the IT sector, I think, that would allow a hospital or health system to activate that agreement without still having to put a wrapper agreement around it to meet their own internal policies or risk mitigation factors. So I think the GPOs are still figuring it out just like we are.
Yep, yep. And I'll go back to my other point, or earlier point, that a lot of these goods and services, you're procuring from the same vendors as companies outside of healthcare.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
so it really takes a broader uh, benchmarking or comparison data set, broader experience outside of that. So, John, you've done a tremendous job in the 91. I'll round up to 91 as you have done percent contract coverage. Um, as we've looked at this across a number of healthcare systems and using the broadest definition of indirect spend, our experience is as follows. Looking at only the highest spend contracts, kind of an 80-20 rule across these categories, we find that somewhere between 25 and 50% of the time, the organization has access, ready access, and can deliver the contract, show the contract. So the coverage is much, much lower as an industry benchmark, if you will, than John, you've been able to deliver when you think this broadly. 25 to 50% shows a lot of room for growth.
Yeah.
Peeling it back a little bit, we take a look at them and evaluate these contracts on level of maturity. And in our estimation, about 3/4 of those contracts are either at a low or a medium level of maturity, as measured by several dimensions. And these would include, do they document rate cards by job level? Do they include project staffing models? Do they have compliance considerations or measures? Do they have the appropriate renewal terms, as opposed to just being on auto renewal, which we see far too often? So when you think about contract maturity, or another way of thinking about it, contract effectiveness, we've got a long way to go, as well as just the coverage of these contracts.
Yeah, if I could just comment real quick, I think
Please.
one of the selling aspects for us and how we helped was, I'll just mention, I could relate it to any of the groups, but I'll just use IT as a proxy. Prior to, you go back a number of years before supply chain procurement was actually doing those agreements, it was the network engineers, it was the system administrators, and that's not their core job, right? So where they should have been working and monitoring servers or application health, they were taking time out to negotiate contracts. And so I think you're right. And I don't think anybody's going to want me monitoring the health of our network or applications. And that's just not my expertise. So that was, I think it's a valid point around, there's massive opportunity there. And as we know in procurement, no contract is the same. So having all those right provisions and good structures and policies in place to make sure that you can monitor them are definitely a key aspect.
Very good. Thank you, John. We're going to shift gears here a little bit. I'm going to introduce the indirect procurement maturity model as a takeaway for you. It's kind of this straightforward, self-administered tool. Just as a brief background, I'm going to introduce my colleague, David Kirshner here. David and I have worked together in putting this framework. David, and what's relevant is he served as the chief financial officer and SVP for Boston Children's, University of Rochester Medical Center, and several other places, as well as being a healthcare advisor with Ernst & Young. David comes at this from the perspective of what is the CFO asking of the supply chain organization, and what is the CFO's impressions or assumptions about what's going on. And I think his eyes have been opened of late, in that he and his peers have thought that the supply chain largely has this under control. That between the GPO, again, GPOs have a very critical role in the supply chain contracting procurement area. But from a CFO perspective, he would say there's almost an assumption that it's all being taken care of across the entire spectrum of spending. And what he's come to realize, and what he's trying to share with his peers, the CFO community, is that we've got a long way to go as an industry and a significant opportunity to extend all the great work that we've done in supplies, devices, implants across the full spectrum of spending, and particularly indirect. So we worked on this model to give the industry somewhat of a tool to assess where they were. The intent of the tool is not to reinforce the great inflation that we find in our colleges, universities, high schools, et cetera, but rather to be a more critical view of where are we today, and to give us an idea for building a roadmap to carry on the journey, much like what Cleveland Clinic has done. The maturity model references 5 dimensions: procurement scope, so how much of that indirect spend scope, that taxonomy, does the supply chain organization truly have strategic level of involvement with? Spend visibility, how quickly and how readily can we see what is being spent where? Category specialists, to what degree have we built specialized resources within the organization that understand the category inside and out? I will tell you from my experience, and I'll ask John his own, is that what I typically see is that a couple, maybe a half a dozen people in the procurement office that have responsibility for indirect in addition to what they're doing in some of the direct categories. John, I think you mentioned that you specialize, your indirect folks specialize in those categories, and that's what they do, and they get really, really good at it as a result.
Yeah, there's about 17 of our resources that are under our senior leader for indirect sourcing. And that covers all of the categories in which we talk. They're not splitting their time on, implants or commodities. They are dedicated into IT or facilities or any of the other categories. Yep.
Right. And that specialization is what earns you that seat at the table, because you know the area, you know the vendors, as well as the business owner.
Yep.
And
I wouldn't even go so far as to say recruiting, funding is probably the hard part. But the recruiting that talent generally is easier than the counterpart of that around finding someone who's, has expertise in, I don't know, heart valves, right? Because the population size is so much larger, right? If I need an expert in Microsoft agreements, there's a whole host of folks out there that have great expertise in Microsoft agreements that have never worked at a hospital.
Yep, and it cuts across. So that carries us into the 4th dimension, which is staffing. And I'll dimensionalize this for you. John says he has 17 people that does indirect procurement, and that's all they do. Now, using this model, which we've taken data across industries, and at the Cleveland Clinic's level of spend, we estimate that you would need somewhere between 15 and 20 people, probably toward that higher end. So even the Cleveland Clinic, as long as you've been at this and as progressive as you are in this area, you're just pushing into that world-class level. Okay, with a pretty sizable investment. Um, Now, another way of looking at this, and we didn't test with John, although I suspected you'd be right there. If you look at the total investment between procurement, the analytical support, the vendor relations, and the oversight, plus your technology investment here, we utilize a rule of thumb of 1% of spend should be consumed collectively in support of that indirect activity. My guess is that you're probably fairly close there.
Yeah, I don't know what that number is. I think we'd be below it. Just by nature of it's, and I'm sure this will resonate with folks on the call. Like it is, we think of it at least internally as every dollar that we consume, whether it's an indirect staffing person or not, is $1 less to go buy a new CT machine that actually helps patient care and brings in revenue. So it's a fight every day. I totally get it. Yes, I wish I had more people because we could do even more things and drive further value, but it's a never-ending balancing act for sure.
Yep. Yep. Good. Well, thank you, John. So, John, as we look across this, and I would argue in your support that given the time and investments that you've paid here, that you would be pushing leading to world class in most, if not all, these categories. I would suggest to you that the one area that maybe you are more in the emerging area, feel free to agree or disagree, would be in spend visibility. And the biggest distinction there is that to be leading or world class, you would need cross-industry benchmarks
Yeah,
to really be able to do that well. Is that a fair assessment?
it is. I actually think it's one of the big issues, and I'll go broad for a second and maybe go detailed, but like I generally think there's really pretty good data out there when it comes to goods agreements, right? And we can broad brush and say goods are more on the clinical side, although that's not to say there aren't some on the indirect side. And service agreements tend to be more on the indirect side. And benchmarking on service agreements as a broad statement is not easy. I tend to always use the example of, being in Cleveland, we unfortunately have a lot of snow removal and a long snow removal season. So, trying to get a benchmark on snow removal for even just all the areas around Cleveland varies because those who've ever dealt with it know, like, are you plowing an open parking lot? Are there light poles? Are there parking stanchions? Are there cars in the lot? Like, I mean, the list goes on. And so I think when it comes to service agreements, trying to get accurate benchmarks is a real struggle still for the industry.
Okay. So John, let me frame this a little bit and maybe get you to opine on the state of the industry in total. So Cleveland Clinic, clearly a world-class healthcare organization, clinical organization, clearly a leading, if not the leading supply chain in healthcare in the US. Gartner has ranked you number 1 3 consecutive years. You've invested a lot of time and energy and resources in the indirect area. And you're not world class across the board. Striving there, and I think with great plans, and with a strong ROI for the work that you've done. But there's always more work to be done. As I look at the state of the industry, I see us more at the low to maybe learning or even at best emerging levels. Is that your sense as well as kind of the state of the industry itself? Long way to go.
Well, yes, if I broad brush that and I'm basing that for clarity, I'm going to base that on, all the number of peers across, larger IDNs to, single 75 bed, single hospital systems, or hospital, I should say, not even a system. I think that's fair. I think you see such a wide range of that. I think the larger IDNs like the Cleveland Clinic have invested in that, earlier on than some. But you get into this middle range of maybe 5 to 7 hospitals in the system, and they're at best probably have people splitting time where most people are still clinically focused and because that's what's on everyone's mind is, do you have the stent? Do you have the tourniquet? Do you have the patient turning device? And if nothing else, the pandemic kind of also reiterated that, right? It was all about gloves and face masks and gowns, right? It's all about the clinical side of the house, as it should be to a certain degree. But yeah, I think by and large, I think that's a very fair assessment that the indirect side of healthcare related to spend and procurement is still very much fragmented.
Yeah. And in my view, that should take that as a call to action, not a criticism, but an opportunity.
Agreed.
Because every one of our organizations needs to find new ways to lower costs to free it up for the investment in your MRI or investment in nursing staff, et cetera. So it's if nothing else, I hope the audience walks away today with their eyes open with there's a big scope of spend here. There's a great opportunity. And the effort to go after it will take time and energy and resources to get there.
Yeah, I'll make one quick comment on that. I think this is, given the downward pressure that we're all seeing in healthcare, I think now is a time for healthcare procurement to be bold. And what I mean by that is find the story, find the business case that resonates with your organization, and just get one person if that's what it takes, and then sign up for a target. And that's where I think we've got to be bold and say, look, if I can get X funding, I will commit to Y savings at a 2, a 3, a 5X return. And then you just keep building from that. And that's how we've done it for years. Is yeah, we get questioned all the time about how many people and what our spend is, and our labor and everything else, but we can return that back in multiple folds of ROI that is tangible to the bottom line budget that we don't spend every year. And we sign up for big targets every year, and every year I have the same reaction of, I don't know how in the world we're going to get that number, but we figure it out along the way. And I think now with that downward pressure and all the cost pressure that's on the hospital systems, I think the opportunity is right for procurement folks and leaders around the industry to take that as a tactical advantage and be bold.
Yeah, yeah. John, I refer to that as the go-gets that keep coming out of the annual budgeting process, and that
Yep.
the finance department identifies a gap from what needs to be budgeted for the year and what they've been able to identify, and that's the go-get. And they go to the supply chain organization saying, now go get it. And heretofore our degrees of freedom are, let's go back to a vendor and negotiate a little harder and go through the exercise one more time. Our vantage point, John, I don't want to speak for you, is that there's a relatively under exercise or untapped area for all of us that we can use to address that necessity of going to get the additional savings.
Yeah, I could not agree more.
Yeah. So I'm going to shift to our questions in our final 10 minutes or so here. John, there's a question that I think is directed toward you. You've been at this for 17 years down this journey. Was there a particular inflection point or a point in time that really you felt like the juice was really starting to hit, and what was that really was the signal to you or the organization that you're heading down the right path? If there
Well,
was.
that was perfect timing for that question, given my last comment, I guess. So yes, there was an inflection point, and it was about I would say 8 years ago for us. Up until that point, let me paint the picture, and I'll try to make it quick. Up until that point, we were really on the indirect side in the facility space, a little bit in HR, a little bit in finance, right? But not holistically across any of those spaces. And about 8 years ago, when I was relooking at those things, it was the elephant in the room was still not being discussed. And frankly, that was for us, that was the spend in IT. We had at the time 2 people in the supply chain procurement area that was IT procurement. I would argue they really weren't. It was really mostly what I would call paper pushing at that point. They weren't at the table. They weren't really negotiating the big strategic deals. And similar to what I just said, I think we had, if we go back that point for the clinic, there was we had a lot of targets across leaders in the organization at that time. We had consultants here that were trying to wring out as much of the expense across the organization as possible. We were also undergoing a new CIO. So our long-standing CIO had left and a new one came in. We took it as an opportunity, frankly, to say, look, we know you've got some big targets that were just passed out through this cost-cutting measure. We will take that savings on and we will make it ours and be fully accountable to it. But we want your commitment that all sourcing and procurement will be done out of supply chain in partnership with the IT team. And obviously that was more than one conversation, but eventually we landed with that. And I still remember that day very fondly, because I remember going back and going to the office and sitting down going, what did we just do? Because we got the yes, which we were getting to, and suddenly we had a really massive savings goal just specific for the IT division. And so it was, I had to, I guess I'll say we followed my own words that I just gave it. Situation's a little different today, but I think the principle remains. At some point, you just got to be bold and put a flag in the ground and say, we're doing this. And we don't have all the answers, but we're going to figure it out along the way. And as long as we can get commitment that we'll have the support we need, then I think things will fall in place. So yeah, for us, it was about 8 years ago.
Okay, thank you, John. Another question. I think I'll take the shot at this, and John, you can weigh in if you elect to, or you can pass on it. Somebody said, and I think they probably speak for the entire audience, my organization is overrun with consultants. What do we do that's different than that? Or where does that effort need to be redirected? And now I spent 20 years as a consultant with a big consulting firm, so I guilty as charged, or however you want to put that. But as I think about the indirect spending area, John, what you've done at the clinic, what other organizations are doing in and outside of healthcare, is to do it right takes deep category insight. Like what we said to you, you can't have a procurement specialist be negotiating your IV supply contract one day and then the benefits contract the next day. You just don't, you may be really good at contract negotiation, but you're not deep in knowledge of the category to do it. And I think that's what the consulting world or profession sometimes gets rightfully criticized about, is that they don't go deep in an area. They're very smart. They cut across a lot of categories, very good, very effective. But there are times when you need deep insight and knowledge. So somebody that has, I think you raised the idea of the Microsoft support agreements, so I'll pick on that one. Somebody that has negotiated those agreements 12 times in the last quarter is a lot more valuable than somebody that has did it once 3 years ago or once a year ago. Now, part of that is not only the deep category expertise, but the second part that gets overlooked is the recency. A lot of these categories are moving, and they move quickly. Perhaps the greatest example is when we looked at the overseas shipping during the worst parts of the post-pandemic period, where the container costs just went through the roof. If you were basing your knowledge on what was going on 2 years prior to that, you were worthless. But if you were engaged in it every day, then you actually had something at the table. So I would say, we're all overwhelmed and have a little bit of fatigue on consulting work. I think what's really different about what needs to go here is not only that deep category specialization, but then the focus on executing, delivering the results, not the PowerPoint that says this is what's possible. I don't know if you want to
I'll
add to that at all, John?
Yeah, a couple of quick comments. I think where possible, right, finding a consulting partner that and you touched on it, but I'll take it maybe a little deep. The right database to give you the right information. I'm sure others on the call, unfortunately, we've probably all been a part of a room where someone came in and said, we can save you $100 million, right? And all they did was look at your total spend, and they look at averages upon averages that they've saved other clients or some other place, and they throw some big number out and it gets people's attention. They have no idea what they're really signing up for, because they haven't looked at your contracts, they haven't looked at your spend, etc. So I think finding a partner that has the database, that has those each individual, as you mentioned, if you find a firm that's negotiating Microsoft 3 times a month, it doesn't take too many years before you got enough data points in that database to say we can accurately account for what we think a good deal looks like.
Yeah, yeah, that helps a lot. And then I would opine as well that the cross-industry experience and expertise has some value. You need to understand the domain, healthcare, because we have our quirks and our idiosyncrasies, but being able to reflect what's going on elsewhere. The other dimension is local geography. You had mentioned snowplowing services. You know, I would hazard a guess the best contract that you can negotiate in Cleveland for snowplowing services isn't as relevant if you're a health system in Florida. Or you have facilities in Florida. You know that specific. I kind of stumbled into that one. But yeah, you understand that there are local aspects of it that need to be taken into account as well, whether internal or external. And then, you know, we're getting close to the end of our time. The point I want to make, and then John, I'll give you the opportunity for some closing thoughts, is there's significant opportunity here when we think of the totality of the effort here. And it takes a big commitment of time and energy, and it doesn't occur overnight. Now, the choice that can be made is, do you make, or do you buy, or do you partner? And I can't answer that for you. It's whatever's right for your organization. But I will say that the ROI is significant, and it's meaningful. So, all right, John, any last comments on your behalf?
Yeah, I would just offer this, and I think about this, you know, from time to time, like, what would we have done differently? What would I have done differently if I had to start over? And I would offer this. I would not focus that much on not having all the right data, because I don't think knowing where we're at on our journey, and I still don't have all the data I want. I think I would focus on an area where there was an individual business leader in one of these indirect spaces that was a good friend, a good ally, partner, whatever you want to classify them, and you target that one spot, right? And you make sure they're out front for the successes. Yes, supply chain will get the credit at some point, but put them out front, let them build on it, let them be the voice, and try to find that person that's also a partner and ally to you, but also has great influence across your organization, because as they tell their friends and their colleagues, hey, supply chain really did a great job for us, it'll build from there. So I wouldn't worry about trying to slice everything down to the finite degree before I got started. I would just pick a single area, as finite area as possible, and put a body on it that knew what they were doing, and drive it, and be single track focused for a while until that happened.
Okay. John, we have 1 minute left. I think we've about used our time. I want to just take that time to offer my sincere appreciation for you taking the time today. As always, you delivered. Your wisdom, your insight are tremendous, quite a value to the industry. So I appreciate you taking the time and doing so.
Well, thanks for having me, and I hope there was a little bit of some nuggets here and there for everybody who attended. Thanks, Mark.
All right. Thank you, everyone.